All right, Derek, let's dig into the games of the week here presented by BetMGM. Steelers at Ravens, our first one here. Ravens are 6.5-point favorites in this game. Before we dig into the nitty gritty of this matchup specifically, I want to talk about the implications for the playoffs involved in this game. So the Steelers clinched the AFC North with the win. It's over. If the Ravens win, they are tied at the top of the division. If they both win out after this, the Steelers get it based on tiebreakers that aren't really worth getting into. The Steelers' remaining schedule after this game, Chiefs and Bengals. The Ravens get the Texans and Browns. So even if Baltimore wins this game, they still need the Steelers to drop another one over the final 2 weeks if they want to win the AFC North. With Kansas City in week 17, they still have something to play for. There is a chance, and we'll talk about this a little bit, I assume, in the Thursday night recap when we know what happened with the Chargers and the Broncos, which you guys have already heard. Time is time is an interesting concept here because the Bengals still have a shot theoretically. So the Bengals may be playing for something in week 18 when they play against the Steelers team. The Ravens have the Texans and then the Browns. So that theoretically is an easier path to win out than the one that the Steelers have. But it needs to start with a Ravens win on Sunday if they want any sort of shot at this.
I still can't believe we're at this spot with the Steelers team. The fact that they are in having a division winning game potentially in week 16 against the Ravens, who we thought maybe could be the best team in football coming into the season. And I think outside of a couple of really stupid losses, like still might be one of the best teams in football. But I'm really interested in this game, obviously, because the Steelers, kind of took it to them the last time that they played. And it wasn't one of those like, I think it's funny last year when they played, this Ravens dropped like 1 billion passes, and it was like, what can you do? Sometimes you're just the dumber team. But that really wasn't the case this past game. Like when they played earlier this year, it was like the Steelers did a really good job on defense. They did a really good job on squeezing a lot of routes, especially over the middle. They did a really good job containing Lamar Jackson. I mean, they've contained every quarterback into the pocket this year, and to be able to do it against a guy who's maybe playing at an MVP level was incredibly impressive. So this was not a gimmick win on that side of the ball. I just think the difference now is the Steelers offense feels somehow worse than it was the last time around, which already wasn't very good to begin with. And the Ravens defense is probably better than it was at that point in the season.
I want to talk about the specifics of the Ravens offense, but before we get into the nitty gritty of that, this is going to be framed coming into the game, and especially if he doesn't play well, as though Lamar has a Steelers problem. I don't think that's necessarily true. Like you mentioned that. So we've seen Lamar with Todd Monken play against the Steelers twice. That's it. And in previous iterations of this, Lamar was often hurt when they would play the Steelers. Like he hasn't played the Steelers that many times, considering they're in the same division. So it is a very small sample still, even if he's played against them more than he has against the Jets or whatever random team you want to throw out there. The only 2 times we've seen him play in like a big boy NFL offense in terms of structure against the Steelers team were last year when his team dropped just a disgusting number of passes and passes that could have gone for touchdowns. I mean, the most brutal one is the Nelson Aguilar. I believe it was a slot fade down the right sideline that Lamar just drops in and it just goes through his hands. A lot of the passes they dropped in that game were not dump offs for 5 or 6 yards. It was Rashad, the one that is the best outside of the Nelson Aguilar one. Rashad Bateman drops one in the end zone, and it comes like 2 plays after Mark Andrews let one go off of his hands. All the offensive linemen on the end zone shot of that play, it looks like somebody got shot. Like their reaction, they're just apoplectic that Rashad Bateman dropped that ball, and that's how that game went. Like you said, the game this season, the Steelers did a fantastic job on defense. So I think it's just a more difficult and complex conversation than, Lamar Jackson just can't beat the Steelers. But if this continues, if he has another rough game on Sunday, then that is going to be the narrative, whether it is true or not.
Yeah, I think to this point, it's just like a very small sample. And one of those things that you want it to be a thing, right? You want ex superstar quarterback to have like some sort of, deep rivalry again. Yeah, a boogeyman. It's Ravens against Steelers. They already have a long history. Now you have this superstar quarterback on one side, whereas the Steelers had the superstar quarterback for the long time. Like it's one of those things that you want it to be a thing. But yeah, he's missed more games against this team than he's played against them since he's been in the NFL. And then like we said, some of the last games that he's played in a real offense, when you have one game that was completely out of his control in terms of the way it went, and then one good game against I mean, what would you say the Steelers are a top 7 defense this year?
Yeah.
Like, I think it's not like a huge problem when a Ravens offense that has been rolling all year has one mediocre game against a very, very good defense. Like, that's just gonna happen sometimes, and so I'm not that worried about it. I don't think it's like a real thing at this point. This week is huge in terms of just at least getting, people off his back about that, though.
In terms of the final outcome in that game earlier this year, they turned the ball over 3 times, and they were a missed 2-point conversion at the end of the game away from winning the game. So that's worth acknowledging just in totality, but it's absolutely true that the offense struggled. And going back and watching that game yesterday, just trying to remind myself and refresh, like, what was this actually like? I can't remember a game and an opponent this year where, like you said, the Ravens offense has been so squeezed in where they want to throw the ball. So the number that jumped out to me, the Steelers play a ton of single high, a ton of cover 3, a ton of cover 1. So they played a lot of cover 3 against the Ravens in that game. The one quirk in terms of coverages is that they played a lot more man on early downs than you might
Mhm.
expect. So that was the only kind of thing that was out of character, but it was still the same coverage menu we're used to seeing. In that game against cover 3 looks, Lamar goes 5 of 12 for 65 yards with a negative .33 EPA per dropback. That would be the worst in the NFL for any quarterback. That is a really, really bad number. On the season, Lamar has the third best EPA per dropback against cover 3 looks of any quarterback in the league. So typically, if you play zone against the Ravens, they can find those chunks. But I thought the Steelers did such an excellent job, mostly of just getting depth on the second level. There was a throw, I think, in the second half of that game where Lamar is trying to find Mark Andrews up the seam on the left side, and he airmails it in part because Patrick Queen does such a great job of getting depth under that route that it shrinks the window for where Lamar can go with the ball. So I think that was the biggest thing that jumped out to me is the windows that the Ravens are typically trying to hit to get those chunks in the passing game. I thought the Steelers did such a great job of shrinking those over the course of the game. The question now becomes, how can you kind of crack those open a little bit more? And I do think there are a few things that they could possibly tap into.
And that play I think is important too because Queen does a really good job of getting depth, but Dante Jackson is also the corner, and he does an awesome job of overlapping and like staying on top of
Yes.
the seam and squeezing it and making sure there's no room to throw it. So them being able to do that pretty much all game, no matter what the Ravens were doing, I thought was really important. I think one of the other things is you didn't really see the Ravens hit any of the deep over routes that they. I mean, if you watch any other Ravens game, they hit like 3 of them. And so the fact that that got taken away and that really wasn't on the menu for them, I think was important. And then, too, you kind of mentioned some of the man coverage stuff on early downs. This is a Steelers team that, because of Joey Porter Jr., is pretty comfortable playing like press man coverage. The Ravens, Rashad Bateman can kind of beat press coverage, and some of his numbers against it are good. The other guys can't. Like Zay Flowers isn't going to do it. Aguilar's not going to do it. The receiving core is not really built that way. So in that sense, the Steelers are kind of built to do this. I thought the other thing that was interesting too, and I looked this up on tight window throws. Zay Flowers is 3 of 13 in terms of making catches. Rashad Bateman is 1 of 5. Like when these guys have to make the tough catches, they just don't connect on. And I'm sure a couple of those are Lamar just missing and not really giving them great chances. But these are not guys who make great contested plays. And if you're going to have a Steelers team that is constantly playing in your face, constantly forcing a lot of these tight windows, especially in that 1 to 10 yard area, I can still see the world where the Steelers defense does really well. I do expect the Ravens to play a little bit better, but you can still see a lot of like the reasons and the pieces why this would still be maybe a little bit of a struggle.
I'd like to see them try to. I mean, if you watch that game, they're doing man beating stuff on third down, and the Steelers are just playing zone behind it. So I
Hmm.
think they just had a bad sense of when to run certain concepts against the looks that they were going to get. A couple things that they were able to tap into that I would expect to see more of. If you're having an issue with the depth that linebackers are getting against the windows you're trying to hit over the middle of the field, an apparent answer to that would be try to make those linebackers play closer to the line of scrimmage. And if you look at the best plays the Ravens had in that game, a lot of them were off play action. Lamar was 3 of 6 for 77 yards on those throws. There was a chunk he hit in the second quarter to Rashad Bateman that's the type of thing I want to see more of. Part of the problem is they weren't in that many advantageous downs and distances. They were running the ball a lot on early downs, and then there were a lot of negative plays and a lot of penalties that were kind of forcing them out of chances to use more play action. And then the other thing was their best plays in this game were out of 22 personnel. Let's get super heavy personnel and use play action off of that, but you can only do that if you're in downs and distances that are conducive to playing that way. So not shooting themselves in the foot in the way that they've had a propensity for doing all year is another necessary ingredient of this.
And I think there are kind of two parts to this. One is the penalties. They are John Harbaugh's a great coach. It is baffling to me that this team makes as many penalties as they do. Like it just blows my mind. It's especially on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, you can see on defense they get some defensive holdings and stuff like that because their secondary can be a little bit grabby and stuff. But it's a lot of them are false starts, holds. It's a lot of the offensive line where like they'll have a successful 5-6 yard run on first down. Oh, it's 1st and 18 again because we got a holding. Like it just they are constantly putting themselves in. Like Houston is really the only other offense that puts themselves in that bad of holes consistently. The Ravens offense is just a little bit better because Lamar is Lamar and will bail you out a little bit more. The other thing that is a little bit frustrating to me, I think Todd Monken is a good offensive coordinator. I think he's been very additive to what Lamar can be as a player. I do think though, there are times where what he does as a play caller is frustrating. Where he'll give up on the run game maybe a little bit too early, or he'll struggle to find what pitch he wants in the run game, or he'll like call play action in the first quarter and then never again for the rest of the game. Like he just I think the structure of things are good. I think when he gets into his designery bag, like last year's game against the Lions or this year's game against Denver, it can look unbelievable. But there are just some times where he loses the plot, and that happens to all but like 6 play callers. So I don't necessarily think he's unique in that way, but I do think at times that is what can slow down this offense.
It's a great thing to bring up because I think that in how we've tried to bucket the Todd Monken experience in Baltimore, a lot of it's been look what he's allowed Lamar to do. Look what this, again, like adults grown up passing game has allowed Lamar to do. But there are layers to this. On an individual game basis, he can have some stinkers. There are some moments where they're running a screen into a look that makes no sense. Like it just, there are every once in a while against good defenses. The Chiefs game last year against in the AFC Championship game comes to mind where it's like, man, he just doesn't have a feel for how this game is playing out. So there are a lot of positives that have come along with him coming to Baltimore, but there are moments where he can be a little bit frustrating when it comes to having the clicker in a big game against a good team.
Exactly. And that's that those little advantages really matter in January. And again, I think he's an above average play caller. I would say he's probably like around the 10-ish range. I think he's really solid. It's just a little bit different than having Matt LaFleur or something like that, where every single game and every single drive, I know that guy's going to have the right answer. So maybe for this game, they'll still be okay. But I do think in general, it's something to think about for the Ravens a little bit.
Two more things I wanted to mention just about the Steelers part of this specifically from the last game that we played between these two teams. One, all the plays where we're not blocking TJ Watt or we're delay blocking him with a tight end, those are in the trash can.
Yep, throw him out.
I have absolutely no interest in those. There are teams. I remember when the Browns were playing the Steelers. The Browns play the Steelers twice a year. When the Browns were the type of offense that were early in Kevin Stefanski's time, where it was a lot of boots, a lot of nakeds, they didn't boot against the Steelers. You don't do it. There are teams that just truly do not run plays where he's unblocked. That should be the approach for everyone because he is liable to just destroy everything you do in that regard. The other part of this is I want to acknowledge how well specific Steelers defensive players played in this game earlier in the year. Patrick Queen was insane. He was
Revenge
absolutely
game.
insane. Revenge game. He was at a whole different level. And in coverage, playing down against the run, he had that huge forced fumble. Watt had a big game. And then the other guy, Cam Hayward, had like 3 deflected passes in this game. And we've acknowledged this a little bit on the show this year. It's important to just remind people what level Cam Hayward is playing at in his mid-30s. He has a very real argument to be like a first-team All-Pro interior defensive lineman this season, and I believe his age 34 or age 35 year, which is bonkers.
And it's just annoying that he's so good at like the just get your hand up and deflect a pass. I swear I've seen him do that against a number of teams this year. Like when you have the explosive potential with Watt, Highsmith is a really good pass rusher, Benton can be really explosive, and then you have Hayward who gives you all of that, but also just has that one play a game where he does something that's a little bit annoying, where he just gets a hand up and he's smarter than you. It's just frustrating, man. Like the fact that him and Calais Campbell, who I know we're not talking about the Dolphins right now. But the fact that those two guys are doing this at like 35 plus is just, it just doesn't make sense.
On the other side of the ball, there isn't really a ton to say right now based on where the Steelers' offense is without George Pickens. We talked about this going into the Eagles game, and they really, really struggled against Philly. The offense kind of feels DOA to me without him because of how important and central he is to the way that their passing game can operate, which is kind of a hilarious place to be Based on how we were coming into the season, I remember when we talked the first time we ever discussed the Steelers, and we were talking about George Pickens in our AFC North preview, which was our first one in the previous series that we did. I was like, you know what? I think there's more to George Pickens than the way that he's painted, just as this big vertical kind of ball winning X receiver. I think that he can take his game up a notch this year. And that happened. But I still didn't think we'd get to a place where he was the most important piece for an NFL offense. I think where I've arrived with Pickens is he is the most unlikely, irreplaceable player in the NFL at this stage of the 2024 season.
He really is. And I could not have predicted this coming in because I came into the season probably a little bit, he's a funny player because I think we came into the season. You thought that there was more untapped potential than I probably did. And I think you were right on that. And I think I leaned on, man, he's just not a reliable player. He does some weird stuff sometimes. And I think both are true. He's
Yes,
become
he
a
still is
player.
that.
Yes, he still is that. He's become a player that they absolutely need from an explosiveness standpoint, from a winning down the field standpoint, from what he's done. I think yards after the catch this year. I think that's kind of been the big part to me that has leveled up all of that. But then he was getting benched earlier this season for effectively like for no reason, at least from the outside that we could tell. And then he's getting a penalty a game. He's getting all these tauntings. Like he's just a hilarious player. And so the fact that this guy that there's always something funny happening with him, you absolutely still need him on the field or your offense can't function. I don't know if there's another player like that in the NFL right now. I really don't.
Who would it even be? He
I,
is absolutely the most volatile, important player we have in the league currently.
I really can't think of who else it would be that is like that, just one of one in terms of what they bring, both good and bad.
There are probably some quarterbacks you could throw into that conversation, but for
But like
style of
quarterback is
play.
such a different, it's such a
Exactly,
different
exactly.
beast. Yeah.
So even with the Ravens defense has definitely been better in recent weeks and they are on the upswing. I think that's important to acknowledge. And yeah, I think there's some people who've been frustrated with the discourse around the Ravens this year where it's like, this is an 8-5 team. How can they be one of the best teams in the league? Like there are moments where records are deceiving. Like their top gear is still very dangerous. And I think that is worth acknowledging. But in order to really believe in that, you have to see them get over humps like this one, where they're beating these good teams that we think are complete on defense. And we kind of see them move past some of the frustrating stretches we've had from them this season. And I think a really good performance against the Steelers defense, even if the Steelers offense is a little bit hampered, I think that would go a long way in kind of having people believe in what the Ravens are actually capable of when we get down the stretch here.
Yeah, I think if they handle business this week, and then I think next week they get the Texans, and if they beat them by, I would say, 10 plus points, the way that I expect them to, then it's like, all right, they've had some weird points in this season, but we're at the end of the season, and they're basically the team that we thought they could be.
And if they could win the division and get a home game and start off that way, I think that would go a long way as well. Let's get to the next one here. Texans at Chiefs. Chiefs are -3.5 in this game. I want to start with the Texans because on our preview show last week, I think this might only be interesting to me, was what do the Texans look like coming out of the bye? Is there anything materially different about the offense where we can start to believe a little bit that things could be different in the home stretch than they were over the first 3 quarters of the season? They come out, some tweaks along the offensive line, right? So Titus Howard moves from right tackle to left guard, which had been just a crater for them the entire year. Blake Frischer, their rookie second round tackle, steps in at right tackle. Okay. Will that make any sort of difference? The answer is really no. It just
No.
didn't really make any sort of difference. The same frustrations we had for most of the year showed up against the Dolphins. They win that game in very ugly fashion because of what their defense did. There was a play, the first sack of the game, I want to say, the Dolphins are in a mugged up look with 2 linebackers, and they
Hmm.
run like a pressure stunt where Jordan Brooks picks the left guard, and I think it was Zach Sealer loops
Yeah.
around. Jared Patterson, the center, completely unaware of where the stunt is coming from. He's wasted on the play. He does not touch a defensive player on the play. I was talking to an NFL offensive lineman about this earlier in the morning because I want to be like, who actually screwed up here? Like, how should I be taking this in? And he's like, there's like 5 different things that happened that didn't necessarily have to happen this way. You should be able to block this up. And that is the story of the Texans season. You should be able to block this up, and somehow they cannot. And this is a very interesting kind of connection with the previous game. So the Ravens offensive line coach Joe D'Alessandro, passes away before this season. It's incredibly sad. They have a new offensive line coach that they have to insert right before the year starts with a bunch of moving pieces along their offensive line. So a couple weeks ago, I was like, who was the guy that took over? Like, I don't think I ever really noticed that. And it was George Warhop, who has been around the NFL for a long time. He was in Cleveland for a little while. And when Kyle Shanahan, or right before Kyle Shanahan was there, he was in Jacksonville for a couple years. In 2022, he was in Houston. So they move on to a different staff. They bring in a new offensive line coach. The guy who replaced the old one in Baltimore is getting that group to play at a really nice level. And now the Texans offensive line cannot block a soul. So the decisions that you make are very, very important. They have consequences.
Very. It's so funny you say the whole story of the Texans offensive line is you should be able to block this up. Yes, like you're just getting beat on the same stuff the entire season. And look, if a team runs 8 pressures on you in a game, you probably will lose a couple of those. That's just the nature of it. You can't be right every single time. They lose like 6 of them. It's unbelievable the amount of like unblocked pressures and immediate pressures, and a guy gets stuck in a one-on-one that he's not supposed to be. Like it's very frustrating. And honestly, them changing around the offensive line, moving Howard to left guard, bringing in Fisher to play right tackle. Maybe if Fisher just wasn't ready earlier in the season, but this is a thing that if they made this move in week 7, I could sell myself, okay, maybe by the end of the season, they can start to figure some things out. It's week 15, 16, man. Like, and you've already had your bye week. Like, I have a really hard time believing that this is going to get any better by the time it needs to get better. So this feels like it was a little bit too little too late. And then the rest of the offense, I like in terms of the design and stuff, I didn't feel any better about it coming out of the bye than I did coming into it. The first drive is hilarious to watch. It's just all of the vanilla Shanahan hits. They run like outside zone toss, and then they run a jet sweep from under center, and then they run like a play action where they try to throw over the middle. And it's like you're just playing all the basic hits from 5-6 years ago. And then the rest of the offense, the rest of the game pretty much plays out to that similar fashion where it just feels like you're watching the stock standard version of something. It's like watching Gus Bradley's defense, where it's like, okay, I get what you're trying to go for, but this is such the vanilla pared down version of all of it that it's just completely uninspiring. And to get away with it, you need the Legion of Boom, or in the offense's case, like something similar to like what the peak 49ers are. And your offense just isn't that good right now. So they're just a very, very frustrating unit to watch. And this late in the season, it's hard to imagine it's going to turn around in the way that we've wanted.
I want to talk about 2 drives from that game about the Texans offense that I think are indicative of where we're at right now. The first drive, like you just mentioned, most frustrating part of that drive for me, it's 4th and 2 from the 25-yard line.
Yes.
Your offense has done nothing for 6 weeks. It's the opening drive of the game. Do we not think it might be worth seeing if you can get that and you can punch in a touchdown to try to build something, to try to capture something at the beginning of that game? So even that is just like a little thing that I think ultimately does go a long way.
And it's not at midfield. They're at like the 30.
Yes.
Like if you lose that, if you don't convert that and you give them the ball at, let's even say you get sacked or whatever, and it's there on 35. How different is that from kicking the ball to them on a kickoff? Like, it's really not that big of a difference. Just go for it. Especially too on the 3rd and 2, CJ Stroud throws like a wheel route. And so when I was watching it in real time, I was like, oh, cool. They went for this aggressive route and route combination on 3rd and 2. That's awesome. They're going to go for it on 4th down. And then they bring the punt team out. And I was like,
so they kicked field goal.
What are we doing?
They kicked a field goal.
The field goal.
They kicked a field goal, but it was still like,
what are we doing?
That's exactly right. So you throw the wheel route to Joe Mixon on 3rd and 2. It's like, okay, because you're going for it on 4th and 2, and then they And the second sequence I wanted to talk about is in the second half. And they run as a negative run on 1st down, which is they love a negative run on 1st down, this team. On 2nd down, they throw a screen to Nico Collins that goes for -2 yards. And then CJ Stroud misses a deep curl that he would have hit last year. That to me is the Texans offense in 2024. The screen is the one I want to focus on, though. I think that the screen game and the health of your screen game is directionally accurate for the quality of your offense. And I think that for 2 reasons. One, I think that screens are all about design and details, right? That's what a screen is like the landmarks, the timing. I think that how the screens in your offense are taught is often indicative, not every time, but often indicative of the details in your offense overall. The best screen team in the NFL right now is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The details of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense is excellent. And the other thing about screens is that they're a play caller play. They're about situation. They're about understanding when to call that. It's hard for your guys, the quarterback, to overcome a screen. It's mostly about when you're calling it into the look. What sort of feel do you have for the game? So if screens are generally accurate in terms of the direction of your offense, the Houston Texans, so I'll start with the Bucs. The Bucs have positive 17 and a half EPA on screens this year. Baker Mayfield does. That is the highest in the league. The Texans have negative 17 and a half. That is dead last in the NFL. So there is a 35-point difference between the best screen team and the worst screen team in the league. And the fact that it's the Bucs and the Texans feels so appropriate to me right now.
That is basically a field goal swing a game between these two teams in just this one little. I mean, how many screens are you even calling a week? 3, 4?
Yeah.
Like for those 3, 4 plays to be effectively a field goal swing between these two teams, and you feel it too. And this is how you get high level offensive passing production out of an okay quarterback, as opposed to a great quarterback feeling completely bogged down in the way that CJ Stroud has been this year. Like, I'm still coming out of this season thinking that CJ Stroud is like a top 10-ish quarterback and a really, really good player. But you have so many of these situations, like you said, that drive where you explain where failed run on first down, lost screen on second down, and now he's in 3rd and 13. And you know what? That deep stop route he throws to Nico, I think it's Nico Collins on 3rd and 13 or whatever it is. He can make that throw. I've seen him make that throw. He made that throw a bunch last year. But when he has to make that throw more often and is under more pressure than he was last year, it's just hard to do it all the time, especially when you're like 22 years old. And so I think it's just been
He's
unbelievably.
shaken.
Yes, he is.
He
He's
is
not as
shaken.
aggressive as he was last year, it feels like. And when he is, he has those throws like that where he throws that ball short. I think because he's worried if he tries to hit Nico Collins in the chest there, he's like, what if I'm off? What if I actually throw it a little too high and it gets tipped up and it's intercepted? So he's just throwing it at his feet, hoping maybe he'll go dig it out for me. And that's just for him to be playing a little bit that way. It's frustrating because we know how good he can be.
I love that you're saying this because I'm talking to their staff this summer and we're talking about CJ and just the idea of him missing low. When he misses, it's low.
Yeah.
And that was conceived of as a good thing because if you're not having overthrows, that's a better way to miss. You're not going to turn the ball over. But I think now he's short arming stuff and he's not stepping into throws as much in the pocket because I think he's worried about that space. And so those low misses, we're seeing them way more often. And I think you're noticing that as a negative part of the offense. And the team I want to compare this to, and because I think it's a similar conversation where you have a quarterback who's like, I know this guy can play, but everything around him just feels like it's rotting right now. Last year, it wasn't dead last, but it was second to last in the NFL. I think it was a very similar feeling where you just can't find anything that works for you on offense. Was the Trevor Lawrence Jags. And I think there are a lot of elements of this offense that remind me of the conversation we were having about that team last year, where everything that they were trying to tap into, every easy button they should be able to hit, wasn't working for them. And that is how the Texans offense feels right now. Right now.
It's absolutely how it feels. And honestly, there's almost some level of where a little bit of what they're doing in the passing game is different, but like with the Jaguars, it was, they were the worst run team, one of the worst run teams in the NFL. They were getting pressured all the time. They were giving up all these unblocked pressures. Their screen game, like you just said, was terrible. And then for them, their answer in the passing game was, Trevor, we need you to win 6 yards at a time. You're going to throw
Yeah.
so many stick routes. You're going to throw so many speed outs. And for the Texans, it's a little bit different because it's, hey, we're in 3rd and 12. Can you throw this dig route, CJ Stroud, against when you're getting an unblocked pressure? So it's a little bit different in terms of the visualization, but that like burden on the quarterback, it absolutely feels similar for, again, guys that I know can play at a top 8, 10, 12 level.
Yeah, the numbers with and without play action this year are interesting. It's the last thing I'll say because I do think that they're also indicative of where we're at. When this team is in favorable down and distances and they can play the way that they want to play, it's not great, but it's not terrible. On play action throws this year, he still is above average if you look at the efficiency numbers, which is not necessarily surprising, but it's indicative of how this offense can be when it's playing its own style. Without play action this season, he is 31st, CJ Stroud is in total EPA. The only guys he's ahead of Deshaun Watson, Caleb Williams, Will Levis.
And you know what? That's a great point because what did I say coming into the season? I want to see them fix their drop back passing
Yes.
game for CJ Stroud and really let this be something for him. I will not argue that, CJ Stroud has had some misses and stuff, and we can talk about all the reasons why. But I think so much of what this offense needed to take the next step was you got to be better in the drop back passing game. You got to have more there. And they've done such a poor job fixing that all around him. And a lot of it to me boils down to the offensive line, but even just some of what they're doing conceptually and stuff like that. It's just frustrating.
The nice thing is, they're playing against a team this week that is very normal and very vanilla on defense, and I'm sure won't be doing anything against them to create some more of those unblocked pressures.
Yeah, Spags is just like it's just like Gus Bradley. You know, you're getting every down. There's nothing to it.
On the other side of the ball, we have a Chiefs offense that has gotten Patrick Mahomes banged up and knocked around more in the past 3 weeks than he ever has in his entire career. And now, over the next 3 weeks, and the gauntlet started last week. So if you look at next gen, the Cleveland Browns are number 1 in the NFL in pressure rate. The Texans are 3rd, and then over the next 2 weeks, they have the Steelers who are 7th, and then they end the season with the Broncos who are 2nd. So in a 4-game stretch, we're getting 4 of the top 6 pass rushers on a pressure basis in the NFL playing against this Chiefs team that can't really protect their quarterback. So what act 2 of that stretch looks like after last week's game against the Browns? Absolutely my number one question about how it's going to go on this side of the ball.
I am deeply, deeply worried about that. Not just for this game, but for like you said, for the entire stretch that they're going to have, and then really into the playoffs. This season, according to True Media, Patrick Mahomes has been hit 68 times. That is the highest in the league. The only other player above 52 is Joe Burrow, who again he's throwing all the time. That offensive line is terrible. They're the only two guys that are hit as much as they are. Over the last 3 weeks specifically, Patrick Mahomes has been hit 27 times. The only other player above 20 is Bryce Young, who he's been holding the ball for a really long time. And so, like, some of that is honestly self inflicted. But, like, he's the only guy getting hit at this rate in the pocket. And look, for as great as Patrick Mahomes is, and for as much as I think he can fix, and for as much as I think he can create explosives out of nothing at times, especially once we get into the playoffs and he really has to. I do think there's going to come a point where like this is just too much attrition. Like you are just getting hit too many times. And I don't care how good you are. I don't care if you peak Tom Brady, peak Dan Marino. If you're getting hit 10 times a game, the way that he has been the past few weeks, it's going to pile up. And if he's playing these top 5, 6 pass rushes this week and then through the rest of the regular season, and then he's going to face some good ones in the playoffs, I have a hard time believing that this isn't going to slow them down and kind of be what really finally hurts this team.
I think the lines in both of these games are very instructive, right? Because we've had this Ravens team that's been really frustrating all year. The Steelers have a very impressive record. It's a 6.5 point line in that game. This Texans offense that has been hot garbage for 15 weeks is playing against a Chiefs team that has 1 loss, and the Chiefs are -3.5 in this game. To me, it's a very good signal for like where we're at with all 4 of these teams as we round toward the home stretch here.
Yeah, I think that's a really good, especially too, like you said earlier, the records can be deceiving a little bit. Not it's a 9-win team isn't actually playing like a 3-win team, but you can have 1 or 2 loss differences where it's like, yeah, man, some stuff looks a little bit different than the records might indicate.
Anything else about this Chiefs offense against the Texans defense? The Texans defense that's coming off arguably probably their second best game of the year. The game they had against Buffalo earlier in the year is probably their
Pretty
best game.
good.
But we have seen what this Texans defense is capable of when they are clicking. And you have a Chiefs offense that's kind of on the other end of the spectrum. Any other kind of weak points in that matchup that you will be watching that you think are potentially dangerous for Kansas City?
I mean, so to me, the Chiefs have been okay this year against man coverage, and a lot of that is because Patrick Mahomes could scramble, and he always had the ability to get outside the pocket and make some plays. And the Texans are a defense that is very willing to play man coverage, especially on third down. Well, I don't think any of the Chiefs receivers can separate consistently against the way that these corners are playing. Obviously, Stingley has been maybe an all-pro this year. Kamari Lassiter, I think, is playing at a high level. But then if you have that on top of the fact that maybe Mahomes with the high ankle sprain is not going to be able to run around as
Yeah.
well and be able to convert some of those where it's 3rd and 7 and he gets exactly 8 to go convert. Well, then now we have a huge problem because you have maybe the best pass rush in the league who is going to be able to hunt him down back there. So I think that is 3 weeks ago, I might have said this was actually kind of a favorable part of the matchup for Kansas City. Now, I think because of the injury and because of the offensive line, honestly, maybe getting worse, I think it's probably leaning towards Houston in that sense.
What a weird place to be.
I know.
The fact that I think I'm pretty sure. Where did you have the Texans offense in your top 10 offenses list coming into the season?
Oh, I can't imagine it was lower than like 6 or 7. I
And
don't
you had
know
the Chiefs
exactly
at
where,
1,
but
right?
yeah, probably them
I
or
think
like
I
San
think
Francisco, something.
I think
I
you had
don't
the
remember
Chiefs at
exactly.
1.
Yeah.
I admit you had the Chiefs at 1 or the Chiefs at 2, and I had the Chiefs at, like, 4 just 'cause it's like, they probably won't keep the pedal on the floor the whole time, but they'll still be really good, and I'm pretty sure I had the Texans at 2.
Hmm.
The fact that now it's almost Christmas, and I'm worried about how ugly this game is gonna be and, like, who can get to 19 points first is a very strange place for us to have landed.
It's not where I want it to be.
I've got him. You want him? You want where
Oh,
you guys had
man.
him?
I guess
Yes.
so.
Robert, you had Texans 4 and Chiefs 5.
Oh, that's better than I thought.
Okay.
Derek, you had Chiefs 2 and Texans 6.
Oh, who did I have at 1? Baltimore, maybe?
You both
In
had
San
you both
Francisco.
had San Francisco.
Oh, San Francisco. Yeah.
The historically great offense from last
Right.
year. That's not as bad as I thought it was, the fact that I had them at 4 and not 2. I think I put the Rams at 2, which looked awful for a good chunk of the year, but the Rams are now, like, 8th in weighted offensive DVOA.
For the times that they've been healthy and had their guys, they probably are like the second or third or fourth best offense in the league.
If you look at those rankings that we did before the season, I was thinking about this earlier this week because the Packers are right now a top 10 defense by DVOA.
Mhm.
And all the ones that didn't go right, like the Cowboys defense, there are a lot of examples of this. It's like, okay, I understand why this happened. The Texans offense is the only one where it's like, there's no explanation.
It's the same guys.
There's no like bad luck. There's no bad breaks that led to this. It is just an out and out disappointment in every conceivable way.
Yes, that's why, like you said, I can sell myself on all the reasons I was wrong on the other ones, and I can compartmentalize it and understand it. The Texans, it's like you had all the same guys. It's year 2 in the system. Your offensive line is mostly the same. Your amazing
The
young
offensive line is
quarterback should,
better, theoretically
yes,
better.
theoretically, yes.
And this is something we said as part of these discussions. And if I ever say it again, I want one of you to slap me through the computer. The phrase "it can't be worse."
Oh,
The Texans
it's
offensive
the
line
NFL. It can always
couldn't
be
be
worse.
worse. It can always be worse, and it is important to acknowledge that. All right, doing one thing that we're watching from each of these next 2 games, 2 big games between probable playoff teams. Eagles at Washington. This is a potential wild card preview, as Bauer notes. First game was, a big win for the Eagles in the end, but it was closer than you think. The Washington actually led 10-6 at the end of the third, and then we had our obligatory monster Saquon runs to put this thing away. I think both of us have the same thing that we're focusing on in this game. We want to talk about Jaden Daniels going against this Eagles defense. So what about the first matchup kind of has pointed you to what you're watching the second time around between these 2 teams?
Yeah, so I think for me, they played in week 11,
Week 11.
and that is right around when it started to feel like the Washington passing offense was losing a little bit of something. Jaden Daniels, I think, had just had his rib injury. I think we were all doing is the cliff coming, all that stuff. This is when it started to fall away a little bit. And so I did a little bit of digging, and I think anecdotally, we all feel like the offense doesn't have as much pop. Like in that first 8 weeks where Jaden Daniels looked like a superstar, it was consistent and there was a level of consistency, but it was just they would have 2-3 plays a game where they were hitting Terry McLaurin on a go ball, or Zacchaeus was randomly wide open for some reason, just all this stuff like that. Since week 10, which is the game right before these 2 played, since week 10, Jaden Daniels has the second lowest explosive passing rate in the league versus 2 high coverages. The only person lower than him is Cooper Rush, who is not a starting quarterback. By week 1, like he's you don't go into the season with a guy like Cooper Rush. They're really good in terms of success rate. Like Daniels is good at finding the zones underneath and really good at scrambling when he needs to. It's just they're not generating the explosives that they need to against those coverages. And the reason I looked this up was last week against New Orleans. New Orleans did a really good job with being in these 2 high coverages, putting a shell on everything, not letting them get access to a lot of these deep throws. And I know Daniels barely missed one to McLaurin, but that's kind of the thing, is that if defenses are giving you fewer chances to get these explosives down the field, and then you miss on the 1 or 2 chances you get, well, then where else are they coming? The run game isn't explosive, and you're not as good at, getting these yak explosives as like the peak 49ers or anything like that. So I think that to me is the biggest reason why the offense feels a little weird right now.
Yeah, looking at it, they had one run of 10 plus yards the last time they played the Eagles. And the run game has been explosive for this team over the course of the year. So if you're not going to be able to get explosive runs against the Eagles, can you get explosive passes? And the number that I was looking at is Jaden Daniels since week 5, I want to say, is third in success rate against too high shells pre snap. He's ninth in EPA per dropback. That's still good. But the way that you can explain that gap is you're getting a lot of underneath completions consistently, but you're not getting a lot of explosives. And what defense plays more too high coverages or more starts with more too high shells than almost any other in the league? It is the Fangio defense. It is the defense that inspired most of this. They're at their core. That's who they want to be. So I think that whether you can find explosives against a defense that wants to play this sort of style, a lot of indications about what Washington has been the last month or so would lead you to say no.
Exactly. Like this is for a lot of reasons. I think a team that has the kind of toolkit to dismantle this offense a little bit. Obviously, for they love to be in these too high shells. I think in terms of containing the quarterback in the pocket, they can do a good job because they get interior pressure, which to me that's the best way to get Jaden Daniels a little bit nervous in the pocket is he doesn't love to step up and stuff like that. So if you can
Yeah.
just immediately crush the middle of the pocket, force him out, it's like, okay, well, he's gonna, when he gets outside of the pocket too, he becomes a runner. He doesn't necessarily become a thrower. So I think that's kind of an advantage for the Eagles. And then the other thing is the Eagles have been a good run defense team. And what I was watching last week with Washington versus New Orleans did a really good job of spilling everything to the perimeter because their running backs aren't fast. Like Washington's
Yeah.
backs aren't fast. It's Brian Robinson, it's Austin Eckler. You want to get these guys out on the perimeter instead of between the tackles. So if a defensive end is getting zoned his way, he's not stretching it out and running with it. He's shooting back a gap and immediately trying to get explosion in the backfield. Or if he's getting a puller his way, he spills it instead of boxing it and making sure it pushes inside. So them doing that, I think, is great. Where New Orleans did a really good job of it. Philly has the toolbox to do all of that stuff, and then you create the havoc in the middle that they have with the defensive tackles. You got linebackers who are good at cleaning stuff up. It's kind of the perfect mix for them to be able to do whatever they want against this kind of offense.
I like this a lot because when you think about when Washington has struggled up front over the last 5, 6 weeks or so, that Dallas game, they moved Micah Parsons inside for a huge chunk of that game. In this Philly game, that's where Philly's best players along the front are. Jalen Carter and Milton Williams are the driving force behind the Eagles pass rush. The interior has been the best part of that. And there are so many plays from that previous matchup where you have these back blocks as part of all this pulling stuff that Washington's offensive line wants to do. Those look really good on the chalkboard when the guy that you're blocking back on isn't Jalen Carter. He didn't do a lot of stuff as a pass rusher in this game. I thought Sam Cosmi actually played well, but in the run game, he was an absolute menace. And their run defense in general, this number to me was shocking. So since week 5, or let's give them a little bit of space before they kind of became the Eagles defense we've come to understand. The Eagles defense is 5th in run defense success rate. 5th. They have on 80% of their run plays, they have 6 or fewer guys in the box.
It's crazy.
80%. That is the highest rate in the league. The league average is 60%. The team that's number 1 in run defense success rate over that stretch is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Bucs have 6 or fewer defenders in the box on 50% of their plays. The Eagles are at 80, and they are in the same zip code as them as a run defense down to down. That is remarkable. And I think that is a commentary on what sort of interior defensive line play we've gotten from this team this year and what sort of play we've gotten from those linebackers. Zach Bond showed up in a big way against Washington last time based on how Washington wants to play. And I expect that to potentially happen again.
I do too. And that's the thing. That's why I say they have the toolkit for this because of what they do structurally. If you're going to be in those too high, safety looks, you want to defend the run by pushing it out to those safeties where those guys can fit in the alley. So if that's what they want to do anyway, and this is the best way to defend Washington, they're in a pretty good spot.
Let's get to our next one here. The Vikings at the Seahawks. What is the one thing that you are looking for in this Vikings-Seahawks matchup?
So I expect the Vikings to end up winning this game, but I do think Vikings offense against Seattle defense is a really interesting matchup. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One, I think we've talked about, I think for Seattle, their formula is we're going to do just enough to defend the run on early downs. We're going to get you into 3rd and 6, and it's going to be a clear passing down. And we're going to.
They are the best team in the NFL in EPA per drop back on 3rd and long situations this year. I was looking it up yesterday because I was curious about the Steelers, who are not as good as I thought they'd be.
That's the Mike, really? Huh.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the Mike McDonald magic, man. Like that's his down. He's just so good at manipulating your rules, understanding when and how to call some of these pressures, mixing up who is actually coming, being fortunate enough to have a ridiculous nickel corner who can blitz in Devin Witherspoon, like, just all that stuff. So I think all of that stuff is really important. And I think when you look at Sam Darnold, he's been really, really good this year. He is 13th in EPA per dropback under pressure, which really isn't that bad. The problem is he's under pressure a lot, and especially in pure passing situations, he's under pressure a lot. So if they can get them into, I don't know, 5 or 6 third and 8 pluses in this game, there's a pretty decent chance that Sam Darnold is going to give you one, or at least give you an opportunity to get hands on the ball. That's where I think that the Seahawks need to be able to sway this game.
That to me is a huge gap between the disappointing performance we saw from Seattle's defense last week and what they had done for most of the previous 5 or 6 weeks. The Packers game feels like a little bit of an outlier, I think in part because Green Bay's pass protection and Green Bay's quarterback is very good at mitigating protection, and their offensive line in general has been really good in protection for most of this year. For all the strengths we've seen from the Vikings offense, the ability to protect their quarterback and their ability to assert themselves on the ground, that it's not the same as what we're talking about with Green Bay. So I feel like this has a chance to be a bounce back game for a Seattle defense that I thought was playing at an extremely high level before that Packers game.
Absolutely. And there's a very unique style to the way that Darnold is playing right now that I also want to highlight, which I'm not sure if this is necessarily something the Seahawks can pick at or whatever. I just found it interesting. I looked up throws of at least 3 seconds. So you hold the ball for at least 3 seconds and you throw the ball at least 15 yards in the air. Darnold has 4.79 of those throws a game. It is the highest in the league outside of Anthony Richardson, who is
Just
like doing it
bombs
at
away,
center.
man. Good
It's literally just
Lord.
bombs away. And then I even brought it down to just in the pocket. So like you're not extending the way that Anthony Richardson can. It's 4.21 of those passes per game, which is the most in the NFL. So you've got 4 plays a game where Darnold just walks back there, plants himself in the pocket 7 yards deep, and says, all right, eventually I'm going to find Justin Jefferson on a post route. And they're doing it at a higher rate than anybody in the league, but it's also the second highest mark since 2020. And the only guy higher than him was last year, Will Levis, who was like doing an even more comical version of basically what Sam Darnold is doing now. So again, I don't know if this is necessarily something the Seahawks can pick at. I just think it's really interesting that they're kind of getting away with a very unique style of passing offense right now.
They are, and in part because of the way the pass catchers are playing. One of
Oh,
the
yeah.
guys I was most wrong about coming into the draft, it's not that I thought he was a bad player. I just had a lot of questions about what Jordan Addison would look like in the NFL. He's slight. You go back and watch those games. I remember watching the Utah game, his final year at USC, and him getting pushed around outside the numbers by some of those Utah DBs. And they're very well coached in the defensive backfield and have been for a while based on the 6 Utah games I've watched over the last 10 years. And what he has brought to this offense, the contested catches that he makes, he's such a great complement to what they have in Jefferson. And I feel like he's very well deployed. So the fact that you have, right now, how many wide receiver duos in the league would you take over Justin Jefferson or Jordan Addison? The Bengals guys? Is there anybody else?
Bengals, I think you can make an argument for the Eagles because to me,
Yeah. Yeah.
like Jordan Addison is like 95% of Devonta Smith. Like I think
Yeah.
Devonta is a slightly better player, but they're pretty much the same thing. And then AJ Brown versus Justin Jefferson kind of just comes down to like stylistic. So, but those are probably the only two that I would make a really serious case for at this point.
Yeah, I understood Jordan Addison obviously had a good rookie year, but I
Mhm.
think he has taken a real step, and I think that that's kind of changed the complexion of how this offense feels. On the other side of the ball, what I'm watching is, can the Seahawks keep this from being just an absolute disaster? It sounds like Geno is going to play. If he didn't play, this was setting up for one of the ugliest games that we've seen offense defense so far this season. With an entire week of practice, you would hope that you would get a different version of Sam Howell than the one that you got in cleanup duty last week against Green Bay. But Sam Howell is somebody that has shown a propensity for taking just an obnoxious amount of sacks behind arguably the worst offensive line in the NFL against a team that does a pretty damn good job of heating you up. So having Geno in this, I think, gives them at least a shot to look like they can move the ball. But if Geno's at like 75% behind that offensive line, the pocket movement goes down, the play extension goes down, and you're playing against this Vikings defense, I still think that there is a chance that this can be a really, really rough night for Seattle.
I think it's still. I think I would have said it could be a rough night still, even if Geno was fine. And so now, obviously, 70% of Geno, I think, is still considerably better than whatever Sam Howell is going to give you. But if you're going to be a little bit slower, a little bit more hesitant, or maybe not even hesitant, it might be a little bit more willing to get the ball out quickly so you don't get hit again. That's really tough against Brian Flores because he's a guy
Yeah.
who's gonna, if you're
He
a
wants you
half
to do
second,
that.
yes, if you're a half second too early on something and a little bit too, jump to the gun to make a throw, oh, there's Andrew Van Ginkel, falling back into a passing lane and stuff like that. So I hope it's not a complete disaster, and I would at least hope to see Geno Smith get out of this game, not having his injury get worse, so that we can maybe still get to a point where the Seahawks are able to squeeze into the playoffs here at the end.
The last thing I wanted to mention here, talking about how the health of your screen game can be an indication of the health of your offense. The Texans are dead last in total EPA on screens this year. The Geno Smith-led Seattle Seahawks are second to last. And I think that there are a lot of similarities when you watch these two offenses where you just think they are just grasping at any thread that they can right now. You use whatever analogy you want. They're trying to keep their heads above water. Like, there is a real desperation, I think, to the way that the Texans and the Seahawks have played. So the fact that those two teams are at the bottom of the league in that metric specifically, it's not at all surprising to me.
I mean, it's perfect because how many times have we been talking about the Seahawks offense and then been like, this is just like the Houston Texans offense, by the way, or talking about the Houston Texans offense and then saying, oh, this is just like how it's like in Seattle, by the way. So the fact that they are both there and this is a measure of kind of your offensive infrastructure as a whole in a way, it's pretty fitting for both of these teams.
It's also fittingly depressing for me because if I'm talking stylistically, what guys look like at their best, Geno and CJ Stroud are like two of my 5 favorite quarterbacks in the league to watch. So the fact that this is what they've been dropped into this year it's been rough. It's not been fun. It's not been fun for me. I'm going to be honest with you. And I think that we may have another round of that this week against Steve Spagnuolo and Brian Flores. All right, I'm going to kick this off. And this isn't even specific to whatever we're going to see on Sunday. This is more about a big picture discussion that I wanted to have as we move into the offseason. The Colts and the Titans are playing against each other this week. I wanted to ask you this. 15 weeks into the year, where are you at on the coaching staffs in Tennessee and Indianapolis? Because we're obviously almost a full year into the Brian Callahan tenure in Nashville. And now we're almost 2 full seasons in to the Shane Steichen tenure in Indianapolis. And I think coming into the year, you and I collectively were pretty excited about what this Colts offense could look like in year 2 with him as the play caller and with some of the pieces that they had. So as we get toward the end of the year, I feel like sort of the heat around both of these potentially has changed a little bit. Let's start with Indianapolis. Where are you at right now with what you've seen from this Colts team in year 2?
I'm definitely a little bit lower on them and more concerned. Like, I thought part of what Steichen needed to prove this year was how can you marry some of the RPO quick game stuff you did last year with Gardner Minshew with a huge arm, we can run around, we can do all this crazy stuff in Anthony Richardson. And I think they probably leaned a little bit too far into the things that Richardson maybe wants to do and, appealing to him just chucking it down the field. And I think they probably leaned a little bit too far into that. And so maybe I have some concerns there. It's also a little bit troubling that Richardson didn't really take any meaningful steps forward as a player. Like, I still think some of the strengths that you saw and some of the flashes you saw as a rookie are there. It's just you wanted to see him maybe clean up his decision making to make it a little bit faster. You wanted to see his footwork and accuracy be a little bit better in the short area, and it just didn't. And I think to some degree that has to fall on Steichen. I do think Steichen gave me enough like built up equity for how good the first season looked that I'm not ready to completely throw everything away, and I don't think he's bad or anything. But I do think next year you need to see some level of development out of the quarterback and out of the offense and make it be a little bit something different. I also think that they just need to be more serious about what they're doing in terms of the defense. Like, they have enough players in the front 7 to be a good defense. I think Steichen needs to probably change up the play caller and be a little bit more aggressive on that side of the ball, and maybe just a little bit more willing to push the pedal there and really give yourselves, because I think it was fine to have Gus Bradley where it's like, all right, we need a guy who can just give us enough as we settle into this thing. okay, well, you settled in now. Like you need to really go make a push. And so I think that's kind of the two areas where I need to see a little bit more going into next season.
I was going to ask you a question, and I'm trying to find the right quarterback to use as an example for this, because
Oh
I'm trying to
no.
separate the lack of development we've seen from Richardson to the overall way that we feel about Shane Steichen as like an offensive architect. So no matter who I choose here, it feels like it's going to be a hot button name. So I'm struggling to find one. Let's just use Brock Purdy. Let's just throw Brock Purdy out as like the 14th best quarterback in the league for this particular example. If Brock Purdy was the quarterback of the Indianapolis Colts for this entire season, and their offensive line stayed relatively healthy, where do you think this offense would rank in all the metrics that you would look at, and how do you think you would feel about Shane Steichen as an offensive football coach?
I mean, it would probably be like 10% better than it was with Gardner Minshew, because I actually think in a lot of ways they're like Purdy is just a better version of a lot of the things that
It's
Gardner
kind of why I
Minshew.
wanted to pick Purdy.
Yeah, I do think that is good, and I think there probably is a chance that Purdy is a better fit for what Michael Pittman wants to do and wants to be, and so I think that in some ways that could be better for the offense, whereas the guys that are good for, and honestly better for Josh Downs, whereas the guys that are good for Anthony Richardson are Alec Pierce and then in theory AD Mitchell, even though that has been one of the worst connections in the entire league this season. So I do think there's a pretty good chance that Purdy would give them some degree of stability over Richardson. I just don't know if the ceiling would be like meaningfully different than what it was with Minshew.
It's funny, we talked about this yesterday, me and Matt Harmon, talking about the pass catchers in Indianapolis and just how the quarterback has reframed those pass catchers and the importance of them. Like, Alec Pierce becomes a necessary part of the Colts offense, in part because Anthony Richardson is your quarterback. And I also think that AD Mitchell would look like a better player with Brock Purdy, simply because some of the play extension stuff with Purdy specifically allows Mitchell to be a little bit more useful, because Anthony Richardson isn't doing a lot of stuff off schedule outside the pocket. Like, that's not really the type of quarterback he is right now,
And if
even
he
if
does,
he's
he just
mobile.
heaves it 50 yards down the field.
Yes.
Like it's not like a looking for the 12-yard who can I find near the sideline. He's like, nah, I'm just gonna chuck it, bro.
And so that's kind of what I'm getting at here, is why this is a complicated conversation, is that the quarterback, it's not even about the quality of the quarterback. If you're like, all right, is he quarterback 25? Is he quarterback 18? Whatever. The style of the quarterback, I think, has made it a little bit disjointed with some of the pieces that they have. And then you combine that with the offensive line was a great unit coming into the year. I really do think that. The injuries that they've started to sustain have been an issue. Ryan Kelly has missed some time. Will Fries, who I thought was playing at a really high level and is honestly like an interesting free agent piece this year. He's going to be coming off of a serious injury, but if I were a team that felt comfortable with the medicals, I think he's somebody that you could bring in on a pretty moderate deal and get good starting guard play. And then Braden Smith has missed some time now. I think he's out with a personal issue right now. So there's so many parts of this where it's like, I don't want to give them a free pass for what some of this has looked like, but I also think that there are a lot of complicating factors here.
There are a lot of complicated. I don't want to give them a free pass either, but I do think again because of the equity I think he built up from year one and how good it looked and what he was able to. I mean, again, people might forget they were a play away, like a dropped pass away from winning the division over Houston, by the way. And so for them to do that, I thought was super impressive. So I think more just after what we've seen this year, again, none of the development within the offense. I think them probably leaning a little bit too far into what they think Richardson is good at instead of trying to bring him along to be good at some of the other stuff, I think has been frustrating. For me, it's more like I'm kind of back at neutral for this coaching staff. And I still think that there's something that they can tap into, but I'm definitely not as excited as I was before, but I'm also not ready to say they need to clean house and restart everything like that.
So let's shift to Tennessee here, because also many complicating factors in this discussion. You have a quarterback who, he enjoys throwing the ball to the other team now and again. You
More than
have
anybody else.
yes. You have an offensive line that the right side of that offensive line is one of the worst right sides of an offensive line in the league. And even if you have a Bill Callahan, and even if you think that you can get some sort of multiplier because of who your offensive line coach is, if you have two traffic cones at two spots along your offensive line, there's only so much you can do. And it feels like that's what we're dealing with in Tennessee. So as you think about the structure of Tennessee's offense and whether or not that's been good this year, and we can project forward to, say, 2025 season. This team has like $65 million in cap space next year. I think who their quarterback is going to be, to me, is the most fascinating part of all of this. I'm tempted to just throw like Sam Darnold on this team on the Baker Mayfield deal and see how it goes because of where they are. The Right now, the Raiders and the Giants are picking 1-2. I think that we could be heading toward a Mariota Winston, Goff Wentz sort of draft here, where even if we don't think those guys are necessarily top of the line prospects, because of the way that the draft shakes out, we could see those quarterbacks go off the board. Tennessee's sitting there at 6. They don't have a guy that they want to draft. So do they go out and they try to find a veteran of some kind, whether it's a Darnold, a Kirk Cousins, a Derek Carr, somebody? They can go out, use some of that free agent money at along the offensive line, maybe pick a tackle in with the 37th pick or in the top 6. So we get to a place where the talent is workable at the most important places, including quarterback. If that's a place where we land, how much optimism do you have about what this coaching staff can do with a group like that?
I don't know what the ceiling is, but I do think I'm willing to give this staff another year because Darnold is actually a funny name because I think Darnold is what they wanted Will Levis to be this year. And I think another actually like comparison point is they want to be what Green Bay is. Like in terms of the way the play action is structured, the areas they're attacking, of the field, how much, actual drop back they're doing versus, some of their play action. They want to be what Green Bay is. They want to be what Minnesota is. And Will Levis can maybe give you a drive like that where it looks like it's supposed to be that way. But over the course of the game and over the course of a month, over the course of the season, he doesn't give you anywhere close to that stuff. So I think if they could get, whether it's literally Sam Darnold or just someone who can, kind of give them that level of play, fix the right tackle spot, they could get this to a spot where it looks like the 16th, 15th best offense, and you can start to convince yourself, okay, we're doing a decent job here. The other thing I'll say in Brian Callahan's favor, and I think I said this earlier, them hiring Denard Wilson was, I think, knocked it out of the park. He's been a really, really good defensive play caller for them, and it's fallen apart a little bit towards the back end of the season because they just have a bunch of like late round picks and UDFA is playing in the back end, and you can tell they're coached well. But at the end of the day, like you just need high end talent to be able to play at a high level, and it's fallen apart for them on that side. But I think they nailed the defensive coordinator pick. I think some of what they have on offense could be workable with a number of new pieces. So I'm willing to give them another year. This isn't to me like a one and done situation.
Their defense has been marred by injuries, but it's a lot of guys who were injured and old coming into this. You know,
Right.
the trade for L'Jarius Sneed, going out and getting Chidobe Awuzie. I was in the moment very skeptical of just the overall offseason plan from this Titans team, and I remained skeptical of how they approach this offseason. But they still have a decent amount of financial flexibility. If they want to go out and sign a guy like a Darnold, they can keep that number fairly low in 2025, and then starting in 2026, you can move on from some of these expensive free agent deals that you signed this offseason, whether it is an Awuzie, somebody like that. So they still have enough wiggle room to kind of do whatever they want this offseason and then potentially pivot heading into the following year. I'm just curious where they think some of those resources should be devoted and if it is spending kind of a sticker price on a veteran quarterback.
Some of the moves this year were funny. They treated their offseason like Will Levis was Jordan Love. Like they were confident that he was that good of a quarterback and that they were going to thread this needle where they could be a 10-11 win team. And it just obviously none of that came to fruition for them.
Yeah, sometimes though, if you get the right guy in there, some
Hmm.
of those things that look disjointed can end up being okay. You know, and I'm trying to be more open to that idea because when the conversation we're having about the Broncos over the last couple of years,
Mm.
where they go out and they spend all this money in free agency, I was like, why are you doing this? Like, what do you think you're going to accomplish? But it's like, okay, well, if you get the right quarterback in there, then all of that stuff can start to make a little bit more sense. You know, all the money that the Broncos spent on their offensive line in 2023, the 2023 offseason. Last year, it looks kind of silly. Like this is one of the worst teams in the league. Like what is the end game here? But then you fast forward one more year and they have the best pass protection in the NFL. So I'm trying to be just a little bit more open-minded when it comes to spending and timelines and how sometimes it's a multi-year approach that if you get a little bit more perspective, it actually can work out in a way that you didn't necessarily expect.
I mean, that's a good point. If Will Levis was anything better than the worst quarterback in the league and actually did take a step, it might not look that bad.
Let's get to yours here. What is the thing that might only be interesting to you heading into week 16?
So we have the Shanahan McDaniel lost season bowl here. We have the 49ers playing against the Dolphins. This game doesn't matter this year, really. Like, technically, these teams could still make the playoffs, but they're out of it. It doesn't matter. What I think is more interesting to me is the way that we are going to talk about these quarterbacks, whether it's at the end of the season or going into next season, whatever it is. I'm even trying to debate internally which one I want to start with. I guess I'll start with Tua and the Dolphins. I think over the last couple of years, I have been critical of the Tua and of the way that this Dolphins offense has been built, but I could at least sell myself like, okay, there's something unique about this where Tua, between his ball handling, between how fast he gets the ball out, there is something here that is unique that you can get away with this. I charted this Texans game that they just played Tua against the Houston Texans. I think relative to like how much we respect a quarterback, this was one of the most offensive games that I watched this year. Just like could not throw the ball past 10 yards, did not want to throw the ball past 10 yards, constantly checking it down when there were chances to maybe go scramble or go make a play. It was just incredibly frustrating. And I got to the end of it and I just thought, if that is all that your offense can be against a defense that is pretty good, but not elite, I've gotten to a point where I think this offense is so inflexible and the quarterback is so inflexible that I just don't know. I just don't know if there's anything more to tap into. And we can look at the numbers and say, oh, they're a top 5 offense and all this and that. I don't think anyone in or around the NFL seriously feels like if you play them in January that they're going to act like a top 5 offense. And that to me is where I've come down with all of this.
All that is totally fair because I think the flexibility and being able to pivot in those moments against really good teams and really good defenses is a necessary component of succeeding in the playoffs. That is one of the reasons that this team craps out every single year as we get down to the final month of the season and into the playoffs. So the inflexibility, I think, is totally fair. And if you're looking at this, yes, he is central to their ability to succeed on offense because they have built the offense in such a way that it's built around the things he can do.
It's
And
like a circular reasoning thing.
yes.
It's frustrating.
And so here's where I'm at with the Dolphins. I don't think we can hem and haw about this all we want. I think their fate has been sealed. Like the way that they have built this, I've always thought if you look at the cap, if you pay attention to the potential conversation around Mike McDaniel and the staff, this has always felt to me like, all right, we have a group of aging, expensive players. We have a quarterback that we have committed to, at least in the short term. They don't really have any other option other than running this group back in 2025 in every way, the staff, the roster, all of it, and hoping, can we get lucky and hot with injuries, with the offense being still really good if inflexible, and we get to a place where maybe it all comes together in the right way and we can do this in 2025. If the answer to that ends up being no, they have kind of clean outs after this. You could move on to a different staff. A lot of the contracts that you can't move on from after this year, you can move on after 2025. Tyreek, Teron Armstead, even Tua. If this does not work out next year with this team constructed as it currently is, you can move on from Tua after the 2025 season for about $25 million in dead money, according to the over the cap number I'm looking at right now. And it feels like that might happen. If this does not all come together next season, they could essentially blow the whole thing up and start over pretty much from scratch if they wanted to. And that's kind of always how I assumed this was going to go.
And I mean, that is a good point. Like, I'm not saying they need to move on from Tua this offseason or whatever. They're going to get next year. I think I'm just at the point where I'm done trying to find the way to justify this and like sell myself on it and tell myself, oh no, there's a reason that this can work. Like, if they are a top 5 offense next year, but it looks exactly the way that it's looked and it's still inflexible and all this stuff, and they
Can't
even
run
win
the ball.
12, 13, yeah, can't run the ball, still struggle throwing outside of the numbers, aren't doing that much to create outside of the pocket, like all of this stuff, then I'm going to be like, I don't care if you have top 5 offensive numbers during the regular season because it's probably still going to look the way that it has when it gets cold in December and January, the way that it has most of the time. And so I think that's where I've gotten to with the Tua stuff is I think I've tried to go back and forth and tell myself that there's still a path, even if it's not my favorite. But I think I'm honestly done with that.
So let's get to the guy who hasn't been paid yet, because that becomes a more
That's
interesting
where it's more
conversation.
complicated.
Okay. How do you feel about potentially the next 6 months here of the Brock Purdy conversation, as he is very likely to get a deal before next season begins?
Because of that, he is a lot more complicated to talk about. I also think it's more complicated because he isn't as inflexible as Tua is. There actually are parts of Purdy's game that you can like start to craft a little bit more of a well-rounded offense about. Um, he's willing to hang in the pocket and throw if he's getting hit. He can make these throws outside of the numbers that Jimmy Garoppolo was never able to make in this offense. You see some of the creativity, some of the scrambling and stuff. It's like, okay, there is enough here where even if it's none of this is elite, he's checking enough boxes that you can sell yourself, that he does enough and he's not as inflexible as a guy like Tua. And that's, I think, good. Where I've come down on though is I think more realistically, he is in the mid 20 teens Andy Dalton or currently what Jalen Hurts is tier of quarterback where it's like, okay, he does enough for your offense and he adds enough as a scrambler and maybe as a deep passer, especially in Jalen Hurts' case, that it's like there is enough to win here, win 12, 13 games and be a conference championship level winning team with enough of the right pieces around him. It's just that you constantly have to have all of the right pieces around him. And that I think is a really, really hard thing to do. There's not that many organizations that consistently can build that. And maybe to their credit, the Niners are one of them, right? Like for the most part, since Shanahan has been there, they have been one of those teams that can build teams like that. It's just, I think when you have this tier of quarterback who is, kind of like you mentioned, maybe 14, 15, 16th best in the league, and then you're potentially paying him a lot of money, that's where I think this gets complicated. So I think I've gotten to the point where if they want to pay him, that's fine. I think it needs to be in that tier 2-ish type of contract. It cannot be at the top of the market the way that Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, Trevor Lawrence, those guys are getting paid right now.
So I think I'm more optimistic about his flexibility than I think you are, in part because we saw them playing a very different style of football early in the year. And when they
Mhm.
still had some of these pieces, this was still one of the best offenses in the league, even without Christian McCaffrey. So we can say, he needs a super team around him to be successful, but it's not. By the end of this, it was Jawan Jennings, a diminished version of Deebo Samuel, no Trent Williams, George Kittle missing a game here or there. And it's not like it's been an absolute disaster. I feel actually okay about what he can look like, even if we're taking a half step down from the type of weapons they're able to put around him in San Francisco. If I'm looking at the contract tier that he probably belongs in. If they gave him the Tua contract, like the normal inflation after 1 year and the cap jumping up version of the Tua contract, I wouldn't really blink. Like that would make sense to me because I think that's the type of player he is. Like paying him like Jared Goff or Tua based on what he has done for the offense, I think is totally acceptable. Paying him $60 million a year or a market setting deal is a completely different discussion. Part of the reason that Dak, who I think is probably at the upper end of the tier that we're talking about with these quarterbacks, is able to demand $60 million a year, is that he has every ounce of leverage, every single ounce of leverage. He can't be traded. He can't be tagged. At the end of the day, if Brock Purdy says, give me $62 million a year or I walk, you could easily just say, here's the franchise tag, buddy. Like there are levers that the Niners are able to pull. So I do think that he is a quarterback worth paying based on what he has shown. And I do think that even on an extension, the Niners are creative enough with the way that they handle the cap. And if you look at how weird their cap is right now, they still have enough flexibility to build a really strong team in this window. But I think that there, like you said, there are levels to what sort of contract you're willing to apply to a player like this.
And that's perfect. Levels. And that's really all I think that this is. And we talked about this maybe over the past couple of years. Is like we're starting to see a little bit more of quarterback contracts actually being tiered as opposed to, there was a run there where it was just if you were the next guy up, you were just getting paid $1 trillion. Whereas I think we're starting to see actual tiers kind of unfold now. And so I think if Purdy kind of gets paid in that second tier, it's totally fine. Because again, I think the Niners have for the most part done a really good job of building this roster. So long as Shanahan is there, they're always going to be an above average offense, almost no matter who is playing on this team. And so if you can build the consistency with Purdy in that sense, you have a little bit more money to spend because you're not paying him $60 million to make sure you can go out and get a new, right tackle or center or whatever it is. Then it's like, okay, that's how you can keep this thing from, falling apart. So again, I understand why they're going to keep him. It's just if he gets that 60 ish $1 million deal, then I'm going to start to have some more questions about the long-term viability of all of this.
All right, let's finish this off with what we want to know coming out of week 16. What do you got for me? What do you want to know by the end of the week?
I just want to know what Micah Parsons versus this Bucs offensive line looks like. I mean, Tristan Wirfs and Luka Decky have been one of the best, offensive tackle duos in the entire league. They've both been awesome this year. And Micah Parsons, since he's been back, has been incredible. He's been one of the best players in the entire league. And even before he came back, before he got injured, he was awesome this year. There are only 4 players with at least a 19% pressure rate this year. It's Daniil Hunter, who has been like unbelievable. Trey Hendrickson, who is a one-man army. Myles Garrett, who has been incredible, and Micah Parsons. And specifically on third down, Micah Parsons has the best pressure rate in the league. So I just want to see what it looks like against a really, really, really good offensive tackle duo.
Yeah, and the offensive line in general for the Bucs in pass protection
They're
has
awesome.
been really, really good this year. They're just, you can tell they're so well coached. Like,
Yeah.
it's just like the awareness and the cohesion. They're a really fun group to watch right now. I have some Micah Parsons on-off stats that I want to read you, just based
Ooh.
on what this Cowboys defense has looked like with and without him this year. Without Micah, some of these are just normal counting stats, but I think they're just fun. 11-2 touchdown to interception ratio without Micah Parsons on the field. 116 quarterback rating, 8.8 yards per attempt, 0.16 EPA per dropback, 49% success rate. The 49% success rate is what Josh Allen has done this season. So without Micah Parsons on the field, quarterbacks have been as successful on their dropbacks as Josh Allen over the course of the year. With Micah Parsons on the field, touchdown interception rate is 10-10 with an 86 quarterback rating and a 40 success rate, 40%. That's Daniel Jones. So the gap between what the Cowboys defense has looked like with and without Micah Parsons is the gap between Josh Allen and Daniel Jones in dropback success rate. That is how important he has been to what they are on defense this year. Some of those on-off stats are always noisy. There's a lot of other things to consider when you're talking about that. But I do think with this example specifically, you can kind of connect the dots from point A to point B.
Yeah, when the player is that good, and like that's, I think, the interceptions to me are the most interesting part. Like, obviously, there's some degree of luck there, but Parsons is such a uniquely quick disruptor that I think there is some level of him immediately getting into a quarterback's face and causing some of these errant throws that it's like he's not catching these interceptions, but he probably is the reason that a lot of these are happening.
Mine for this week, we haven't talked about this at all, so it's time. It's Michael Penix time in Atlanta. What does this look like? It's crazy that we're here already, and I do think that it reframes some of the discussions we were having about how shrewd of a pick this was in the moment. They were thinking we'd be so good that it wouldn't matter, but you are protecting yourself to the potential downside with the Kirk Cousins deal. The problem is you gave Kirk Cousins an astronomical amount of money in March, and now you have benched him. So no matter what happened here, there was going to be egg on their face in some way. Either Cousins was going to be so good you were going to sit this guy for 3 years, or Cousins was going to be bad enough that he was going to have to play sooner rather than later, and then you were going to have to eat a ton of this money. So, but those are larger scale conversations that aren't really that important right now. To me, the bigger thing is, what is this offense going to look like with him at quarterback? And I do think that there's enough to like about everything else going on with this offense that a quarterback with a little bit more mobility, a little bit of a bigger arm, and he's not the most mobile or the most kind of play extender not the biggest play extender that we've seen, but I'm hoping we can have some under center play action as part of this offense now, because you have a quarterback who can move a tiny bit.
It's so funny that Kirk is the guy he's replacing, because I think if you talk about Michael Penix as a prospect, it was like, yeah, he doesn't scramble, he doesn't throw outside of the pocket, he doesn't really do all this stuff, he doesn't do many bootlegs or any of that stuff, but he's replacing the one guy who somehow does literally none of that, and so technically he is more additive to the offense than Kirk was in that sense. And to me, it's a lot of I just want to see what they get out of the vertical game, because I think we've seen at stretches where Mooney can be a really good vertical player. London is not like a run by you vertical player, but if you want to just throw it up to him the way that he was doing with Real Madunze last year, okay, I can see the world where that starts to work a little bit. So that's mostly where I'm fascinated with this, because I think Kirk at a lot of points this year has struggled to want to hang in the pocket, especially recently, and like really just chuck it down the field. So if that's something that they can access, maybe call one or two boots that they weren't able to call, with Kirk Cousins in there, and it can change the offense a little bit. It could be something. And the last thing I'll say too is I know I was a little bit more adamant on them keeping Cousins in there, but I did say, hey, if he struggles against the Raiders, who are like a mediocre defense, then it's probably time to pull the plug on this. And he had his worst game of the season, arguably, against that Raiders team. It was one of his he's had this stretch where the past month or so, it's been, he had 0 touchdowns, 8 interceptions coming into this game, whatever it was. But by success rate and by EPA per play, I think this was his worst game of that stretch. And so I understand why this was finally, kind of the straw that broke the camel's back on that one.
Yeah, your season is hanging by a thread now.
Yeah.
Like if you continue to lose these games, then you're going to miss the playoffs 100%. And I think that the hopes they had coming into the year, the timeline they were trying to operate on, just little things like the Matt Judon trade. You don't do that if you don't think that you're capable of winning your division. So there's a real argument to be made that the rookie that we've never seen gives them a better chance than Kirk Cousins right now, based on the way that Kirk Cousins is playing. And if that's the case, then you don't really have an argument for why he should be in the game. What happens next, I think, is going to be the biggest question. Like if they trade him before June 1 next year, it's $37.5 million in dead money. That's it. And it would have been, he was making,
that's not that bad
he was making 40 against the cap.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if they do that, they still don't have a lot of financial wiggle room. They're going to have to move some stuff around, but it's not a death knell for their roster next year if they have to move on from Cousins. And it helps when you can go to a very cheap quarterback, which they're going to be able to do. So this is going to be the first step in understanding what the next couple years of this Falcons team looks like. I know they're very, very excited about what he can be. Whether or not that excitement is justified, we start to find out on Sunday. All right. That is all we've got for today. Sincerely appreciate you guys listening. We'll be back with our Week 16 preview on Sunday night. Last thing I wanted to say, I just want to say how much I appreciate all of the messages I've gotten this week from people. So many emails just on Blue Sky or Twitter, wherever it happens to be. If you sent me a DM on Instagram, I've seen all of them. I've seen every single one that somebody has sent over the last 3 or 4 days. I'm going to spend some time this weekend responding to them. It means a ton. It has really made my week easier. So if you were somebody who sent one of those along, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. So thank you very, very much. It means a lot that we have an engaged audience like this that is willing to do stuff like that. So thank you very much. And it really does mean a lot to us. So we will be back on Sunday night with the Week 16 recap. Until then, appreciate you guys listening. We'll talk to you soon.